Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and today we are going to be taking a look at some of my local history here in Florida. Today, we are going to be covering the collapse of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge in 1980. If you are Floridian or have ever visited in Tampa Bay, you may be familiar with the bridge collapse. The Skyway collapse has also come back to the forefront of some minds in the aftermath of the more recent Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse. So let's get into it. The original Sunshine Skyway Bridge opened to the public in 1954, and 15 years later, with an increase in traffic, a very similar structure was built right alongside in 1969 to make the bridge a 4-lane bridge. One structure held the southbound lanes and the other held the northbound lanes. The channel under the bridge had an opening of 864 feet. In the time when the bridge first opened in 1954 till about 1980, thousands of large ships and boats were able to pass underneath the bridge without any incident, but that would soon change on May 9th, 1980. On May 9th, 1980, during a storm, the Sunshine Skyway Bridge was struck by the MV Summit Venture, a freighter ship, which caused the bridge to collapse on top of the bow of the vessel, killing dozens of people. That morning, Captain John Laro was in charge of navigating the 85.5-foot wide freighter through the over 800-foot opening as he guided the ship from the Gulf of Mexico to the port of Tampa. The ship should have been able to pass underneath the bridge without any incident. Having to first navigate through fog, the real turn in the morning was a sudden blinding squall of torrential rain. This sudden storm was also accompanied by 70-mile-per-hour winds, which led to the freighter's radar being knocked out. Laro, who just 2 days after the accident had been slotted for a promotion due to his skill and experience as a harbor captain, would meet his match with this unpredicted weather. With his radar gone, Laro had a choice to make. He could have just dropped his anchor where he was, but there was another ship, the Pure Oil, that had just left the bay and was headed his way. Without any radar, he ran the risk of his vessel being struck by the Pure Oil. Another risk with anchoring was that due to the high wind speeds, the ship, having been close enough to the bridge, could have been forced into the bridge, causing damage. The second option was to continue on the path he was on with no radar and navigate the channel on his own. Laro picked the second option. Unfortunately, the wind speeds that could have knocked an anchored vessel into the bridge also played a hand in the eventual contact the ship made with the bridge, causing the collapse. Without the radar, Laro's ship had unknowingly blown off course significantly. In a brief moment of visibility, Laro was made aware of just how far off course the ship had become. He tried any and all last-minute efforts to try to stop the ship before it hit the bridge, but it was too late. Trying to stop a giant moving object that weighs upward of 19,000 tons is no small feat. At 7:33 in the morning, the bow of the vessel struck one of the piers, which caused a 1,200-foot span of the bridge to collapse and fall 150 feet into the water. Immediately after impact, Laro radioed the Coast Guard saying, "Get all the emergency equipment out to the Skyway Bridge. Vessel has just hit the Skyway Bridge. The Skyway Bridge is down. Get all emergency equipment out to the Skyway Bridge. The Skyway Bridge is down. This is Mayday, emergency situation. Stop the traffic on that Skyway Bridge." With the impact happening at the time that it did, there were many cars traveling across the bridge during rush hour traffic. When the bridge collapsed, there were several cars and a Greyhound bus driving across. When the collapse happened, all the vehicles plunged into the water, killing 35 people, 26 of which were on the Greyhound bus. There is quite a bit of imagery that came from this collapse, one image being that of a car stopped just 14 inches from the 150-foot drop, with the front bumper hanging over the edge. In 1987, a new Skyway Bridge opened up called the Bob Graham Sunshine Skyway Bridge, with many more safety enhancements to avoid something like the first collapse happening again. The bridge itself was elevated to a higher height, and the channel underneath was widened. There are also 2 large concrete barriers and dozens of bumpers that are known as dolphins alongside the channel to aid in bridge safety. The day prior to the bridge opening for use, a shrimping boat named the Deliverance actually hit one of the dolphin bumpers. The boat ended up taking on water and eventually sank after being towed away from the bridge. The damage to the bridge was minimal, so the opening day ceremonies proceeded as planned. In the aftermath of the collapse, Laro was ultimately not held responsible for the disaster. The storm that happened in the time just before impact had not been forecast, and the storm itself completely blinded Lero. It would be over an hour after the bridge collapsed that the National Weather Service in Ruskin, a nearby area, would issue a storm warning. Lero was also unaware that the pure oil, the ship he feared would make contact with his vessel, would actually already been anchored. Without access to radar, which had been taken out by the storm, he had no way of knowing this. The National Transportation Safety Board came to a vote of 3-2, where they found Lero only partially responsible for the disaster. During the hearings, Lero's license had been suspended, but he did end up getting the license back in 1981. Unfortunately, in 1981, Lero developed multiple sclerosis and would become unable to pilot ships any further, forcing him to surrender his license prior to the year end. The ship itself would actually change hands multiple times before it too sank off the coast of Vietnam in 2009 as the Jin Mao 9. Fun fact, if you drive over the current Sunshine Skyway Bridge, right next to it is the remains of the old Sunshine Skyway Bridge in what has now been made into a pier that is officially called the Skyway Fishing Pier State Park. This park opened in 1984. As recently as March 2025, the current Skyway Bridge is on a list of 68 bridges that the National Transportation Safety Board wants to undergo vulnerability assessments. The ultimate goal of the safety board is to make sure that bridges built before 1991 comply with new safety standards that were set, or if these bridges are at risk of collapse if they were ever hit by a ship. I will note that these 68 bridges are not anywhere near a state of close to collapsing. It is just precautionary measures. Today, the Sunshine Skyway Bridge is still actively used by Floridians, tourists, and snowbirds. I myself avoid driving over this bridge as much as I can. It is just a bit too tall for me. I also have a pretty distinct memory of driving over the bridge when I was little, and the tidbit about the collapsed bridge now being a pier was discussed as we drove over the current bridge. I have now mostly gotten over any fear of bridges I had when I was younger, especially since I now have to cross a bridge twice a day in my daily commute to work. Although I don't think anyone could ever get me to drive over the Chesapeake Bay Bridge in Maryland ever again. That was not an experience I'd like to have twice. Sources for today's episode include an article from Fox 13 Tampa Bay titled Sunshine Skyway Bridge Disaster 45 Years Later by Ryan Burkett and Aaron Mesmer, an article about the Skyway Bridge from the Florida State Parks website, and an article from Abandoned Spaces by Samantha Franco. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me over on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.